Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthony, for thinking of me to give comments on this wonderful book, Madness in Enterprise by Professor Nima Bassiri. And thank you for everyone at the Philosophers for sort of putting this event on. I'm delighted to comment. So what I'll do is basically provides a sort of brief overview of the structure and argument that I see of the book. And then I'll offer some sort of half comments, half questions that I'm really looking forward to hearing Nima's responses to. And then as Anthony was saying, we'll sort of open it up for general conversation. We'll see what everyone else has to say. And I'm delighted to comment on Madness in Enterprise because I'm going to try to approach it from two perspectives. First, I'm going to approach it as a historian. I think Professor Bassiri presents a fascinating and innovative approach to the history of psychiatry that exposes the entanglement of our medical, moral, and economic selves. And this book allows for new questions and directions, I believe, not just for critical studies of psychiatry in philosophy and history, but also just more generally. But I also believe for psychiatric theory and practice itself. And that's the second way I'm going to offer comments as a practicing psychiatrist today. So first, the sort of overall argument of the book. This book at bottom, I think, is a reappraisal of how we think about the relationship between economic and psychiatric thought, between capitalism and mental health. As Nima notes, he is obviously not the first to write on this theme. There is a rich literature, for example, that examined the integration of psychiatric into economic reasoning. The turn to behavioral sciences to predict individuals' economic behavior in the early 20th century by the likes of John Maynard Keynes is an example. But Professor Bassiri works the other way around, not how psychiatry has become woven into microeconomics, but instead how economic reasoning has become foundational to our understanding of what it means to be psychiatrically healthy or sick. And following Michelle Murphy's approach to the economization of life, Nima argues that madness became, quote, economized in the late 19th century. That is to say, psychiatric thought was reorganized ontologically in economic terms. Specifically, he turns to the mostly forgotten turn-of-the-century British psychiatrist, Charles Mercier, who discussed psychiatric cases of what Nima calls borderland figures. These patients lay on the borders of psychiatric thought because experts found it difficult to determine whether they were sick or healthy based on an analysis of their mind alone. Mercier argued that to determine the presence of insanity in these borderland cases, you had to look at external behavior and conduct. Mercier's bottom line diagnostic question was, did the patient's mental disturbances negatively impact their functioning in the world? And as Nima shows, functioning here was always economic functioning. The standard for healthy or good behavior was always an economic one. And if you're a practicing mental health practitioner in the United States today, like I am, this actually comes as no surprise. The oft-maligned Bible, as it's called, of American psychiatry, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or for short called DSM, contains a taxonomy of all the diagnoses that psychiatrists use today. In the DSM, functional impairment, which is a quote from the DSM, is the criterion that must be fulfilled for any mental disturbance to count as a psychiatric disorder. But what is functional impairment? It's used in almost exactly Mercier's sense. If you ask any psychiatrist, functional impairment, discussion of functional impairment will lead to a set of economically inflected behaviors and questions. Does the patient have a job? Can they pay their bills? Are they making it to work on time? Are they spending money impulsively and irresponsibly? Functional impairment is the psychiatric litmus test in the past and present, I believe, and as Nima shows, for both the presence and severity of mental illness. And this functional criterion has been critiqued by disability activists, users of the mental health system, and critical scholars of psychiatry dating back to at least the 1960s. This is because whether someone can function often has little to do with the patient or their mental state. Instead, individual functioning is also, and perhaps mostly, a product of the broader injustice of society itself, along lines of race, class, gender, ableism, etc. Scholars like Irving Goffman, Thomas Saz, Michel Foucault have pointed out in different ways how psychiatry operates as an institution that conforms the behavior of its patients to the norms of capitalist society and labels deviation from those norms as madness. Here, madness is defined as the inability to function well in a capitalist system. And I can't emphasize enough, and this is why I've laid all this out, that this is not only, or not even mostly, what Madness and Enterprise is arguing. And this is where the book really got interesting for me. Nima's foundational corrective to this almost reflexive opposition between the irrationality of madness and the rationality of economics is to trace the emergence of what he calls pathological value. That is, there are certain states of madness that possess economic value. In the introduction, Bassiri points to our popular cultural understanding of this, that's sort of latent, particularly in American culture. There's the narcissism of figures like Trump that's productive for political goals, and you might see Liz Lundbeck's work on narcissism here. Elon Musk is a strange, eccentric, but economic savant. Certain artists are manic and erratic, but they are geniuses. In other words, certain pathological states like mania or narcissism, when possessed by certain people, are valued as productive pathologies. Historically, Bassiri traces this notion of pathological value to early entrepreneurs in the 19th century who were seen as strange, abnormal, and eccentric, but who were also incredibly successful financially. And so for turn of the century psychiatrists like Mercier, who I mentioned before, madness in this case was not opposed to capitalism, as critics like Goffman, Foucault, et cetera, have maintained. Rather, madness could be entrepreneurial. Pathology could have an economic value. Capitalism had an irrationality to it. But Bassiri also demonstrates, and this I think was really critical for me as I was reading, that whether a pathology is valued in a particular historical moment is highly mediated. That is, whether your mental disturbance is seen as a good thing depends on far more than the mental disturbance that you have. Rather, it depends on your wider societal privilege along familiar axes of race, gender, sexuality, and ability. Bassiri does a remarkable job of illustrating this in the chapters, and this is where I'll have to point you to reading the book because I don't have time here to explore the cases in the depth they deserve. But in chapters 1 and 3, for example, Nima shows that the whiteness and masculinity of entrepreneurs in the 19th century allowed their pathologies to be valued. White men were seen as eccentric but productive, strange but genius. But this was not the case for multiply marginalized figures. Black entrepreneurs in the South, French industrial laborers, among others, had pathologies that were as tied up with economics, but that were not valued socially and politically. In fact, they were grounds for further marginalization and violence. In other words, pathological value is highly mediated by privilege. This is what Bassiri calls pathological privilege that's at work. And overall, after reading this book, I found pathological value to be enormously useful, and I see it pop up all over the place. For example, in my undergraduate history of drugs course that I teach here at Yale, everyone always laughs when I talk about caffeine use disorder while pointing to the coffee that's on my lectern. And while by strict criteria, many of us would have this disorder, people laugh because caffeine is seen as a habit or addiction that is productive and functional, and that rarely negatively impacts our economic selves. In fact, it may augment our economic activity and our productivity. And I wonder how we might use pathological value to disentangle the medical, economic, and moral reasoning around habit and addiction, and not just to substances. I'm reminded here of confused debates about internet addiction disorder, the mental health impact of social media, and the promises and perils of artificial intelligence. How is both healthy and good use of AI inextricably entangled with, and often I think subordinate to, an economic calculus? In a recent critical discussion on AI ethics here at Yale, one researcher retorted, quote, "But now I'll be able to use AI to apply for more grants. How can that be bad?" Any thoughts on these scattered reflections from Nima or others would be very welcome. I also wonder if we can extend pathological value beyond the mind in psychiatric reasoning. Can we extend it to the body and medicine more generally? And I think, interestingly, this is often how critiques that develop in the history of psychiatry often get expanded to medicine in the sort of historiographical literature. And this is more a hunch here than anything, but I think that a conversation between pathological value and disability studies might help us articulate how certain pathologies, bodily or mental, are conferred an economic value while others are not. What bodily pathologies have value in our society today? I have more thoughts on this, but I want to leave it there for others. I'm not entirely convinced we need to limit the concept of pathological value to the psychological, though there is a certain specificity there that I think is really valuably brought up by Nima's book. And I wonder whether an engagement with disability studies would allow us to sort of broaden this question. I also have to have at least one narrow history of psychiatry question. Nima, you trace the emphasis on conduct and external behavior much farther back than most historians of psychiatry. Traditionally, scholars point to the 1980s with the symptom-based classification of mental illness in the DSM and the rise of behaviorist psychotherapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, as the real watershed for behaviorist psychiatry. Your history is fascinating, not only because it traces this behaviorist slant so far back into the 19th century, but also because it elucidates a connection between behaviorism and economic reasoning. And I wonder if you would agree with the strong argument then that the doubling down on behaviorism in psychiatry in the 1980s was critical for the institutional economization of psychiatry that we see today. And by institutional economization of psychiatry, I'm referring to the increasing encroachment of the interest of for-profit big pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, et cetera, on psychiatric research and practice over the last century. In other words, does the turn to external conduct in psychiatric thought, embraced in the 1980s, but whose history goes back much further, provide the conditions of possibility for this deep integration of for-profit interests into psychiatric care? And this is a really roundabout way of asking, I think, what would your book look like if it pushed into the second half of the 20th century? And my final comments have to do with colonialism, race, and the broader politics of doing the history of psychiatry in the university. Colonialism, as it comes up at least twice in this book. First, in the introduction, you suggest that in much of the critical literature, and I think this is right, the politics of colonial medicine is understood as an effort to associate the colonizer with health and the colonized with pathology. There are certainly examples of this. For example, the British psychologist J.C. Carruthers, who in the 1950s described normal Africans as, quote, lobotomized Europeans. But your approach to pathological value, and this is a quote from your book, introduces a different sort of dichotomy, not between health and illness, but between two different styles of pathology, one regarded as valued and lucrative, and another that is perceived as pernicious and costly. And this orientation, I think, lines up quite nicely with some of the newer work by post-colonial scholars like Warwick Anderson and Mayo Arvin, who study the colonial pathologies of white people in the tropics. In these accounts, white people, and mostly white male colonizers, do get sick and anxious and often in their travels to the tropics. However, their illnesses at a discursive level are always approached as an indictment of the environment itself, of the oppressive heat, for example, or of the fact that the civilized nature of the colonizer conflicts with the uncivilized, primitive ways of indigenous life in the tropics. In other words, the sick white colonizer is not the problem here. It's the uncivilized life of the colonized people or the oppressive environment that makes them ill. And so pathology here attains a certain value as a marker of civilization for sick white colonizers in ways that feel quite related to your approach to pathological value. And the second time you engage colonialism is in the ambitious and thought-provoking conclusion to the book. And your conclusion kind of just asks, so what, as all good conclusions do, so what now? Is there a way, now that we've sketched out the sort of pervasive nature of pathological value, is there a way beyond pathological value in psychiatry today? Given the arguments in your book, and I found this to be very convincing, we can no longer dismiss or critique capitalism by pointing to its madness or irrationality. as so many have, Marx scholar David Harvey, to give one example. Describing the rationality of capitalism doesn't have the critical punch that we might hope, precisely because capitalism and madness are perfectly compatible and have worked in tandem for hundreds of years, as you've shown. So as many have recently, you turn to the revolutionary psychiatrist Frantz Fanon to look for a way out, a way beyond pathological value, an otherwise sort of relationship between our moral, psychological, and economic selves. And I think following some other scholars recently, like Nika Siegel, Camille Robsis, and Adam Schatz, you point to Fanon's understanding of liberation. Fanon did not just demand material liberation from the violent institutions of the colonial state. He also demanded a liberation of the self from colonized subjectivity that had been thrust on to indigenous people. Fanon argued that violent decolonial struggle could undo the psychic marginalization that had undermined how indigenous people see and relate to their selves. My own work on liberation psychiatry in Latin America in the 70s has explored a similar phenomenon, how radical Freudo-Marxists there saw political revolution against US imperialism and subjective liberation from bourgeois subjectivity as part of the same sort of dialectical process. So I think this liberatory psychiatry that you sketch has dramatic consequences for critical practitioners today, and I'm more than happy to, I would love to hear others' thoughts on how this reorients how we see psychiatry, psychiatric practice. I think that's something I've certainly taken away. But my sort of curiosity with respect to you is what role do you see for historians, philosophers, and critical intellectuals in the academy in this liberatory project that you begin to sketch? Fanon also emphasized in essays like On National Culture that intellectual work only had any real purchase when connected to and articulated within a historical material collective struggle. And as you wrote, and I loved this line, quote, "It is one thing to critique and morally reject capitalism, and it is quite another to live one's life in tenacious and open defiance of it." I'll admit on this front that I have some questions that I'd love to hear from you that are perhaps ill-formed and maybe even unfair. That intellectual history that focuses on styles of reasoning, epistemes, historical epistemology, etc., can sometimes reflect and reinforce an epistemic and perhaps political distance between the writer and their work. And it's why personally I tend to, and this may be a bias of mine, gravitate more toward ethnographically inflected and materially grounded approaches to ontology, like that of Anne-Marie Moll, for example, or others, that make room for discussing the writer's positionality and their personal and political relationship to their field of inquiry. But really, I'd just love to see your thoughts here. How do you see the relationship between the academic historian philosopher and the liberatory politics and psychiatry that you begin to sketch in the conclusion? And I hope you take this less as a critique and more as an invitation to just discuss your own relationship to the sort of work that you do. And please feel free to respond to all or none of what I've just laid out. Thank you again for writing a book that is so useful to both think and act with.
Well, thanks so much, Marco, and thank you for taking the time to read the book and for your really wonderful and thoughtful comments. And thanks to Anthony for organizing and everyone for joining virtually. So I've taken a lot of notes, and so I will answer. I'm trying to think of what the best order is to answer all this. Maybe I'll say a couple framing comments that will address some of your questions. In large part, there's almost a pithy way as this book was kind of coming together, like really clearly coming together, a very kind of pithy way that I would sort of hold a set of ideas in my head that could encompass the kind of tone, let's say, or the attitude of the book, which is that it's sort of two sides, well, it's an oddly economic metaphor, two sides of the same coin, that something like pathology must be understood as having a deep economic rationality. Pathology or non-normality, or to put it another way, irrationality. Irrationality has a deep economic rationale. And that conversely, capitalism is productively irrational. And that itself is not necessarily a new idea, but sometimes when the language of the productive irrationalisms of psychiatry get discussed, they are irrationalisms in the sense that, like Weber will describe them, emotions or religious beliefs or dogmatic kind of orientations to the world. And when I say that capitalism is productively irrational, or that irrationality has a deep economic rationality, when I say irrational, I mean it in the sense of a severe mental illness, like serious madness. So, an irrationalism beyond irrationalisms. That's why psychiatry is a really good exemplary discussion of this, of pathological value, in the sense that it's the irrationality par excellence. And when we can see the profound coalescence or the convergence of something like madness and capitalism as being really quite interwoven and interembedded, this forces us to introduce a kind of new narrative. And I will also add that your discussion around the doubling down on behaviorism in the 80s and the role that the focus on external conduct played in essentially the economization of psychopharmacological therapeutics. Like what would this book be if it extended into the 80s? Well, actually, what I just try to do is write the prehistory of that. And it was not in my mind a post-war development, or it seemed to me like it had a deeper embedded kind of history. And one of the points that I kind of want to say is it's been there in psychiatry from the start. It's economizability. There's nothing radically new necessarily. Of course, there are new things that happen or new permutations of this economization. So madness is economized in one particular way at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, and a very different way at the end of the 20th. That's at least my kind of contention. So in a sense, there'd be no real reason to continue the story out, because in a way you can see, sort of imagine how the story plays out. It's the logic kind of just persists as far as I would sort of take it. I really appreciate you discussing the extent to which this notion of pathological value, which I'm not necessarily committed to coining as a concept, but if that's fine. It just seemed like a really helpful way of organizing the idea of what it means to economize madness, and to understand. And I really appreciate the way you draw it out, that madness is something that is appraised according to its economic value. That's what determines not only its social worth, but its medical viability and its moral, let's say, permissibility. So that some forms of madness or mental illness are vaunted as remunerative, or the sort of strange chapter on aphasia and will writing, if not vaunted, then at least rendered as entirely consistent with economic behaviors and tacitly important for a very specific form of wealth accumulation at the end of the 19th century. Or it's devalued, but on economic terms. So it's not just a form of, like the chapter on the pathology of work is not just a chapter about the denigrations of industrial laborers, but the double denigration, that not only are they denigrated from a class standpoint, but also that in fact there's something costly about what they're doing, and therefore costly about the form of mental illness that they're genuinely perceived as having. So I really appreciate that. And as far as extending it beyond the realm of psychiatry, I certainly have no qualms with this. My work in psychiatry is not, I don't necessarily work in the field of kind of mad studies where psychiatry and disability studies meet. I mean, I'm aware of it, but I'm not trying to necessarily push in that direction, though I would hope that there's something here that goes there as well, in terms of the different forms of attributions of value that are given to certain forms of ableness and disableness. I think that I imagine there's something there. And I really appreciate the comments that you made around the caffeine addictions and different forms of conduct that are seen as undoubtedly pathological, right? But also good for us. Coffee gave us the Enlightenment, right? And yet you will have to kill me to take my coffee away from me. It's not, I'm sorry, it's not gonna happen. And that there's something seriously not okay with that, but no one ever sees that as a problem. It's the same with, like, a workaholic. At the end of the day, no one really cares, right? At the end of the day, it's just a slight derivation from having a very good kind of work ethic. I think we don't necessarily see how deep these economic suffusions have kind of taken us, and we've kind of confused moral value and economic value in a very fundamental way. And that's a point that I really try and emphasize in the book to a large degree. Let's see. There's another point I was going to make about that. So I definitely think that this notion of pathological value can have a lot. I mean, as I was, writing the book, it did seem to me that there were other permutations of this, which I didn't want to follow out because, it's already a long enough book. But it did seem that there's something quite present there, even though psychiatry maybe gives us the best exemplary instance of this. At least that was one place where it can be drawn out in the most kind of rarefied way. Your question at the end, and I apologize if I skipped over anything important, please just tell me. I've written a lot of things and I can't quite tell which is which, but so your question at the end around liberatory psychiatry and what the role of the academic is a great question. And I would say that my turn to Fanon, because I'm aware of all the Fanon scholarship that's out there, and the interesting thing with Fanon is no two interpretations of anything in Fanon are ever alike. I mean, they're so quite different, including what Fanon ultimately meant by violence and what he actually meant by decolonization and these various things. And so I take a certain liberty, as you've no doubt seen in this last bit. I will say the turn to Fanon, I hope, so people in the audience who haven't read it, and Marco, you can tell me this is wrong if you think, but it did not seem out of nowhere in that conclusion. It seemed it does come out naturally, but there's a way that I want to read Fanon's liberatory philosophy as maybe slightly different than some of the ways that political or radical psychiatry sometimes imagines with respect to itself. And this is what I was trying to very loosely gesture at, and I'll say somewhat unfairly, it's gesturing at future work that I'm in the process of working on. So it's just not fair to the reader. But it seems to me that for psychiatry to extend itself to such a level of liberatory possibilities that it becomes essentially a kind of transformational practice, a practice of self-transformation, it may not be psychiatry as we understand it anymore. It may start to become a very different kind of practice, a different kind of practice that someone like Foucault called political spirituality, or that some might call religion in some senses. This is what I was trying to do at the end by kind of having a conversation between Foucault and Fanon, who come out of the book very naturally as two people who were interested in psychiatry and who gesture at practices of self-remaking that may initially demand something with respect to psychiatry, but then which take on a very different kind of permutation. So in a sense, I'm not trying to throw psychiatry under the bus or anything like this, or to say that psychiatry is the reason that this has happened and therefore we need to stop. That would be silly and wrong, and I don't agree with it. But it does make me wonder, and you could speak more to this than I can, whether there are internal constraints like the ones that you just described, where functional disorders do seem to be so economically kind of circumscribed now. What would it mean for psychiatry to actually transform itself very fundamentally to the point where it may not even be psychiatry as we know it anymore, something else, some other kind of practice? So this is what I was gesturing at, because that's what you're supposed to do in a conclusion, but also because that's just something that does interest me with respect to kind of future work. I know that we're heading towards the Q&A portion, but Marco, I want to maybe turn it back to you, and if there's any follow-ups or questions that you have, anything I didn't address that you'd like me to maybe address.
No, I think you addressed it and more. My various questions that were sort of all over the place, so I appreciate that. And the one thing I would say, I really appreciate those last comments about is the sort of liberatory self-refashioning transformative project that you're articulating to what extent politically or practically or materially is that possible with
Yes.
within what we call psychiatry today?
Right.
And I think that's an open question, right? Like, and I think it's hard to say. One thing I would say that I found as a sort of resource within psychiatry as it exists is that I found increasingly that people who go into psychiatry, right, like trainees who are coming in, are actually coming into the profession with some vague latent sense of transformational, liberatory, and materially grounded politics that you're sort of elucidating, and which I look forward to seeing in your later writing, articulating really clearly that it's that sort of passion that's latent and unarticulated that often is driving people to psychiatry as the sort of like thing in our society that is supposed to do that kind of work, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that what I've seen in psychiatric training, and I'll speak for myself as well, is this subsequent sort of, in a very Foucauldian way, disciplining, right, of that initial passion that then gets sort of diverted in a kind of Deleuzian way. That initial desire gets diverted into these sort of more economized logics, et cetera. And that is a painful process. Is one, I'll just register. It's an alienating process because the passion that brought you into the thing ends up getting sort of stripped from you, sanitized, et cetera. But the other thing I would say is that it's also potentially a resource. And I think books like yours are important, and scholarship in critical studies of psychiatry are important, particularly in an educational way, because when they're taught to psychiatrists, particularly at a particularly young level, they can start seeing what's happening to them and can start thinking about, how do I mobilize the privilege that I'm attaining with my sort of socially sanctioned degrees to do a different kind of work, to start a different kind of clinic, right? Like to do something that's not sort of where the inertia of the system that I've sort of found myself in, without really having informed consent, like from the get, like of what I was entering, because like, how could you really possibly know? Right. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I will teach with your book, and that I believe that this kind of in teach to psychiatrists precisely as a way of giving voice to anxieties and I can't think of the English, but like a disquieting that sort of happens in psychiatric training that I've heard from trainees all the time, where they're like, yeah, but these criteria for substance use disorder are just about like social functioning. And social functioning looks very different from someone who's unhoused versus someone who's like got a regular 9-to-5 job. And like, what do we make of that? And then in general, psychiatric training is like, stop asking those kind of questions, move on. You've got like 10 other patients, right? Teaching this kind of work allows them to sort of give voice and give a sort of criticality that I believe can have a real practical and political purchase, for doing the kind of work that you're gesturing toward. I hope that's a very optimistic sort of like take on it, but it's also it's grounded in sort of like what I'm seeing among particularly the younger people entering the field.
And as a concluding maybe comment, I'll say the same questions about what are the limits on radical remediation when we confront institutional constraints in psychiatry or medicine broadly could also be asked, and is something I ask with respect to political institutions that presume some kind of remediative practice of being free, of being autonomous. In what sense do contemporary forms of liberal democracy get in the way of this or preclude it, perhaps structurally, foundationally? And therefore, we would be required to kind of reimagine the very telos of something like medicine or politics or something like this. And anyway, this is gesturing towards future kind of work, but this is, I think, along the same lines as what we're just discussing. Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited that your book gets us into that space. Like, I think it does it's the right prehistory for getting us into a conversation that really matters at the current moment. And this is unfair. I'll use my platform here to ask you maybe one more question.
Sure.
Among the institutions you've just listed, which is psychiatry, which is our sort of like capital P political institutions, right? What about the university? Like, what do you see as both the sort of constraints and opportunities? And this is such a large question that I apologize, but this is
I'm not
another way
tenured yet, so I have to be careful about how I ask. And
but
you have to be careful too.
But that's it, right? Like that's the
Right.
thing. It's like we're untenured, and there's a certain sort of precarity and scarcity that that I believe has a material sort of effect on the kind of knowledge that you can produce for your first book. You know, that sort of thing. So I don't mean to put you on the spot in a public arena. So feel free
But I would say
to leave it at that I'm untenured, because there's a real scarcity there.
Yeah. And but just very quickly, it's an analog problem, that there is an institution that is organized with a telos in mind, transformation, right? One becomes something in the university, one transforms, one is enlightened, there's the Bildungs, the kind of self-making. And then in what sense do these institutional, internal or embedded or fashioned constraints preclude it in certain, perhaps necessary ways, right? Are there reasons for why perhaps we shouldn't or are not allowed to be so radically transformed? That would be sort of dangerous for the I don't know, the functioning of the institution itself. So I think it could be asked. I mean, the particularities are going to differ from institution to institution, but we're also talking about institutions that are co-emergent for the most part in their current formations, and so they're undoubtedly part of, you know, inter-embedded structures. And so I think one doesn't stand in for the other, but I think these are analog kind of correlate phenomena. So yeah, and that's a great question.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to pass the mic over to the collective audience and to Anthony, I think now. Looks like there's some great questions here.
Definitely. Let's jump straight in. So I think the question from Joy is a nice sort of starting point, quite a broad question. It's kind of basically arguing that capitalist economics is something that influences communities of people, while psychiatry concentrates on individuals suffering distress rather than communities. So how should we think of the relationship between pathological value as applies to individuals when capitalism tends to work more at the level of communities? Thank you, Joy.
Maybe I'll start this, and then Mark, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. I would actually say I maybe put a little pressure on the supposition, because it does seem to me that capitalism certainly operates at the level of the population, right? There's economic policies, but capitalism is also a social relation between individuals. And I mean, capitalism is a way in which I understand myself. I understand myself as a laboring entity that has to sell my labor on a market, and I have to sell it for the highest possible amount of income, or this, that, or the other thing. Capitalism is a fundamentally internalized rationality that I individually internalize. So it can operate at the level of the population, but I think it fundamentally also fashions individuals. And we talk about capitalist subjectivities. This in my mind this is an exemplary instance of the idea that capitalism is, if it only operated at the level of the population, I think it would be easier to resist, but in part because we internalize it. This is what Louis the Great, you know, the French philosopher, I shouldn't say great, I mean, the murderer, Louis Althusser, describes as ideology, right? It's the fundamental internalization of a certain kind of, well, I won't detail it, but that's what ideology meant for Althusser. So I would resist that. And I would also resist that psychiatry only works at the level of the individual, because it strikes me, and Marco, maybe you have something to say about this, psychiatric norms, it strikes me, have a very pervasive effect on social behaviors broadly construed. This is an example I often use in various classes. When we look on the street and we see somebody acting in a way that does not seem decipherable to us, our immediate thought is there must be a mental illness that this person is suffering from. We don't think they're possessed by a demon. We don't think that they're being spoken to by angels. We don't think various other things. We immediately go to, when I can't understand their behavior, they must be mentally ill. That suffusion of a psychiatric form of reasoning in my mind also suggests that psychiatry works at the level of the population, even though it is a technique that's typically practiced on individuals. So, and it's precisely that convergent point that capitalism works at numerous levels, and so does psychiatry, that these two can meet, and that's the meeting ground that I take advantage of for the book. Marco,
Yeah, I mean, that was beautifully said. I will just maybe provide an example, hopefully to bring it home. If people have been following some of like sort of New York City and Mayor Eric Adams, sort of the way that his government has been approaching the issue of housing in the city, right? And immediately and reflexively in press conferences, and increasingly in policy, Adams and his government have said, if you are unhoused and on the street, you must have some sort of mental illness, right? And that is just a bizarre leap of logic, right? Like certainly that may be the case for some people, and arguably epidemiology, it's actually a minority of people. But there are plenty of structural reasons for someone to be unhoused in our society that have nothing to do with their sort of like with their mental state, right? And so this equation between you are a kind of as a person in a nuisance, a public nuisance to society because you're unhoused, and the solution and problem are defined psychiatrically. This sort of like equation of these two particular things, of your lack of ability to function economically and productively in our system, and therefore it's evidence of some sort of psychiatric underlying issue, is to me what the book is untangling. And then there's the flip side: people who have mental disturbances that are productive economically, who are not seen right as a problem for our institutions. Sorry if that was less clear than it should have been, but that just strikes me as one like particularly like present day example of that kind of thing.
Super. So we have a question here from Mariana. She writes, this is an Ian Hacking style thought, but do we see new forms of mental illness emerging that track emerging economic trends, whether for better or for worse? Nima, any thoughts on that?
Maybe I might defer this to Marco. Are there very economically inflected forms? I mean, something like gambling addiction, maybe. Much more clearly. I still think a lot of what gets like strangely, the stuff around entrepreneurialism is still quite with us. This seems to me to be, we still somehow feel it's okay when a CEO is very bizarre. Like somehow there's some sense that like it'll all go. I mean, look at Musk. I mean, this man is, I don't even think he's I don't think he's quite clever, and I don't think he's a very good CEO at all. He seems to tank most of the things that he does, but for some reason his oddity plays well. And I think part of that is because there's something about this entrenchment of this pathological value that has suffused culturally within the North Atlantic, and people have internalized it somehow to believe that people who are a little bit on the edge of madness and who can orient it towards some productive end are better. It's better to have a slightly crazy CEO than a perfectly sane one, because a sane one is just going to make safe decisions, whereas a slightly crazy one will make riskier ones, and so there's higher profit, right? Or the slightly ill musician or whatever might make a more brilliant song or something like this. I don't think there's any facticity to this. I think it's a certain kind of normative way that we think. So there are novel forms of mental illnesses or pathologized behaviors that are organized around economics, but it still strikes me that today we still value or devalue a pathology or a potential pathology based on its apparent remunerative value. Yeah, Marco?
Yeah, I will keep doing this thing where I just give examples of what you've articulated more abstractly, but I just read some fiction. It's Eleanor Kenton's Burnham Wood, which is like came out I think in the last 6 months. Very like great fun book. But there's a CEO character who's clearly a sort of like Musk type, and it's fascinating to me and lines up with this because this fictional character who's a CEO, actually is perfectly quote unquote normal, however we define that, but actually plays into this sort of like crazed, like eccentric, kind of all over the place, impulsive, at times irrational sensibility that we've collectively constructed around the figure of the sort of CEO entrepreneur, right? And so this pathology has so much value. Not only do we see it in people and we say, oh, like Musk is, all over the place, but like, he's a genius. It's also possible, and this fiction sort of opens that possibility. This is perfectly consistent, right, in the logic of our culture, that a very like sort of sane, just kind of not eccentric, whatever person would actually play into this pathology because it has so much value, so as to seem more like an economic genius. And that sort of like roundabout subjective cultural logic is just bizarre. It strikes me as something that Ian Hacking would have loved to tease apart.
Yeah, totally. Just the looping effect of the entrepreneurial form, right? I want to seem a little bit more like a leader, so I'll be a little quirky rather than completely stable. It's strange. It's so bizarre.
Okay, so this is a question from Alice, who thanks you both for a great discussion, and say, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what, say, a socialist framing of madness may look like, or even a framing of madness that was stripped free of all economic content, if that is possible. So as ever, Nima, do you want to take the lead?
Sure, I can try. I mean, the simple answer, well, I'll say a simple answer and then maybe a better answer. The simple answer is I don't really know, in part because there is work on madness in context of socialist political contexts, which I'm just not aware well enough to know how it kind of operates there in terms of its historical development. But maybe more interesting, what I would say is one of the more underlying, and I would say perhaps more provocative, sub-arguments of the book is that I don't think there has been a modern conception of madness that wasn't economic or economized in some manner. That what is madness stripped of its economic value? The answer is we don't know. We haven't really seen it. Or perhaps this starts to get to the sort of like Foucauldian pre-modern notions of madness you see in Montaigne or someone, where the madman does seem like a prophet or some kind of like angelic figure or someone who's sort of possessed. To put it in the kind of Foucauldian terms, you could say that the modern episteme of madness is an economized one. And you could talk about an economization that isn't necessarily, strictly speaking, capitalist either. That it can still be transactional, it can still be contractual, it can still be about giving something over, let's say, to the populace, to the state, or taking something away from the populace or the state, so a burden or a benefit. These are still economized forms. These are still transactional logics that are not, strictly speaking, capitalist. And maybe one might see this in non-capitalist contexts. But the hard argument here is I'm not sure there is a madness that isn't economized in some fashion. And this is the problem. It gets back to an earlier interaction with the question that we had with Marco. But yeah, maybe I'll turn it over to you, Marco.
I think that's right. I think our notions of madness as they've been articulate, I mean, there's some mad study scholarship that might push against this notion, and I want to gesture toward that, even though ultimately that's not where my comments are going to go. That I'd be curious to have someone here who would speak from that perspective, to say that there is a sort of latent, even cultural, even Western notion of madness that sort of escapes the logic of capitalism, but at least as articulated within the institutions that sort of discipline and regulate madness that have been tracked by Nima here. I completely agree that sort of the notion of madness has been economized. And so what are the consequences of that for a notion of madness that sort of escapes or works beyond capitalism? That's how I will sort of approach that question. And the one thing I'll say is the work that I've found to be intriguing from both Fanon, but also I'm going to plug a Latin American sort of liberation philosopher, psychoanalyst, whose work I love, Leon Rosichner, whose much of his work is still in Spanish, but there are some translations now. both of them articulate the project, given the fact that madness has been economized. You have to have two sides of a sort of liberatory project, which is one to state how has sort of capitalism defined, constituted our subjectivity, right? One, how has that process looked? How has that operated? How has capitalism come to define how we see who we are and what we need to do and what is good and bad and healthy, et cetera? You have to be able to count politically, psychologically for that process of subjectivization and subjugation, right, as one thing. And then in addition, you need to be able to articulate how you might liberate yourself from that position. Because I sympathize with Nima's comment that it doesn't feel like, at least in the local spaces in which I operate, that there's an outside to capitalism, right? So there needs to be a way of talking politically from within capitalism of how you might imagine a different sort of liberatory practice. And that's very abstract right now, but given sort of the constraints of this conversation, but that's, I guess, briefly how I would approach it.
Okay, well, we're pretty much at the end. I thought maybe I'd hand it over to Nima for any final words, any further reflections on anything that Marco said, any of the questions that came up, any generative ideas to close us out with.
In our last 60 seconds or so, well, I just want to take a moment to just thank you both, and Marco in particular. I really appreciate the time that you've taken, and it's also nice to hear that the book does seem to land, at least in some measurable way. You know, sometimes we spend quite a lot of time in our own heads, and so a conversation like this is usually quite worthwhile to hear that there does seem to be some value to the book, pathological or otherwise. So yeah, just thank you to you both, and thanks to everyone for attending. This was great. I appreciate it.